Alright, time to analyze some data. I have compiled all of my time measurements for each step on the spreadsheet, and I'm going to use the spreadsheet to make graphs and charts. And I have it compartmentalized into 4 main operations. The first one being making the plywood strips. And I usually do a much larger production run so that I have material in stock that I could just pull off the rack to make an individual custom frame. So the other 3 steps after making the plywood strips are cutting the individual parts to make each custom frame, and then the assembly of the frame, and then the last step being the disassembly and packaging and shipping. For this operation I made 3 large frames, one of them being very large, but I took an average of all 3 frames and I got a value of 80 minutes per frame with all of the steps and setup time included. There was one setup step that I left out, which was maintaining the molding machine. That took about 30 minutes, but I left it out of this calculation just because it would throw off all of my other measurements there. Okay, this first pie chart is for the time measurements for making the plywood strips out of sheets of plywood, and the setup time for this part of the process took more than other parts. I also can do the same pie chart by percentage, so you can get the percentage values of the total process of processing the plywood. So that's a useful way to look at the data to see how each of these steps compare and with each other. And so the setup time here is not as much because it's just the chop saw and the pocket hole machine and moving the parts around a little bit, so it doesn't take as much to set up the machines. The next one is the assembly. This is the total assembly, and there's not much setup time involved with this part of the process. And I found that the assembly times for each of the frames was relatively similar, even though one of those frames was a lot larger than the others. I did this bar graph as well to compare the time values for each of the 3 frames I did. And the largest frame only took about a minute longer than the smallest frame, and so that difference was smaller than I expected. So when I saw this result, it made more sense just to average the time for each of the 3 frames, because it didn't really make that much difference, because each frame takes the same operation, so there's just like a little more material handling with the larger frames, but overall pretty much is the same time. So this is the packaging step for all 3 frames. Setup time just involves cleaning up and getting materials out for packaging. And the largest chunk of time here was just getting the parts together with the plastic wrap and bundling it up, and it's like trying to fit a puzzle piece together to make sure that everything is secured and doesn't get damaged in shipping. I have to add a lot of extra building material to protect the sharp edges, and it just takes a lot of time to make sure that that step is done right. Yeah, so packaging is a really big part of this operation. So I did this final graph to give me an overall breakdown of each main step. So making the plywood strips, this blue area. I can also see this by percentage, so you can see how these compare by percentage. So The data I was looking for with this time analysis was what was really involved with packaging these frames up, for shipping the products, because I really never had a good measurement of that. So here's my value. It's roughly a third of the whole process at 31%. And, that's a pretty big value considering, the overall cost of the product. This is my final result here. This tallies up all the material costs. What I did here is I added up the exact dimensions of the perimeters, so I get a linear foot value of each frame. And then I calculated my yield, which was about 1.5 sheets to make all 3 frames, including the waste material that was left over. Sometimes the waste factor is high for the larger frames because I can only use 60% of an 8-foot plywood rip, and then the rest of it gets unused. And so I get a value for how much linear feet I can expect to get out of 1 sheet of plywood, and that turns out to be about 37 usable linear feet to make a variety of large frames. So that gives me my value of $1.08 per running foot for my material cost to make this product. So I got my 2 values. I got how much money I made and how long it took me to make that, to give me my profit per hour, which is the final result that I'm looking for. And geez, pretty dismal here, $31 an hour. So, by my estimation, my woodshop costs about $30 an hour to operate. So I make a net profit of $1.17 per hour. So that basically does not even buy me a lunch. So I'm basically working for nothing, just keeping the shop going, but I can't eat breakfast, lunch, or dinner, or really even take a break, because I'm not making any profit, any money off the top here. The downside of my process, making these out of plywood, is that I use a lot more material, and the frame is quite hefty. So the cost of these with the length and the weight is not cheap. So the shipping cost is a drawback. So I don't know. This product might not work for me. I'll have to raise my prices, and if they don't want to pay them, then I got to find something else to make. That's just the way it is. It was a good product, practical product, and if I could get enough artists to come and pick up the product at the shop, I could sell it for a much more reasonable cost, because the cost of disassembly and packaging was so high, and the cost of shipping is so high. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and found the information useful. I hope to do more types of videos like this so I can use my GoPro camera as a time recording device to document my processes and record the time that is invested in a very accurate way that's easy to review. And I'm happy to make these videos so that other people can learn. I'm still learning, obviously, and I think this example with the canvas stretcher business that I started on the side is a good example of what can happen if you just take a wild guess about what your real costs and time investment is. I didn't design my canvas stretcher product to be disassembled and packaged in bundles like that. I was always making them permanently assembled with glue and then just shipping them in bulk, which ends up being a lot more profitable if I can get enough orders together. Woodworking as a small business is not easy. Not everything can be made for a reasonable cost. There are all kinds of limitations, and material handling and shipping is a really big factor. in a lot of businesses. And if you're making products by hand, you have to figure out shipping solutions like any other big business. And that shipping solution has to work and be practical. So, not everything can be made for a reasonable cost because the time factor is so high, and not everything can be shipped for a reasonable cost. And many products are in demand, but really it's just a limitation of getting it from point A to point B.